Yeah, it's really great to be here. Honestly, it's a huge honor for me. Not just because I get to see Adrian and others that I hold very dear as friends, but because this project actually started in a way through the Haven Center. I was invited by Eric to participate in a Real Utopias project called Democratizing Finance, and the aim was basically to write, how would you democratize finance? And I'm like, I have no idea. I have not thought about that question at all. I just think about why it's not democratic. It resulted in a volume and in 2019 with Verso. But that was really the inception of this project. Was Eric Wright asking me to kind of contribute to this. So yeah, it's a huge honor to be able to come here and honor his legacy a little bit. Okay. Let me just shrink this a little bit here so I don't have to see myself. Nothing's more jarring to me. Okay, I want to start with a little bit of a utopian vignette. Okay, imagine that it's the year 2045, and you're running late to a meeting at the Public Bank of Wisconsin. The past 20 years or so, Public Bank has basically done all this investing in housing, in racial disparities, in such a way that you've really seen a transformation of Wisconsin over the past 20 or so years. There's less racial disparities in places like Milwaukee and Madison. There's less homelessness on the streets because of investments into not just housing programs, but also health programs. And you check down on your phone, we still do have phones, in fact, in 2045, and you have a message that says mini public duty notification. You've been selected at random to serve on the People's Bank of Wisconsin on its Racial Equality Commission to ensure the bank's programs meet the needs of racial and economic justice in the state. Your voice and deliberation are essential. Now that's obviously a sci-fi introduction, but just maybe keep it in mind a little bit because we're going to circle back to it in the end. And I do that. Okay. When I first started getting involved in activism around finance, hey, how's it going? It was way back in 2010 or so around Occupy Wall Street. And we had a huge encampment there in New York. And much of the demands were really defensive demands. There were demands about inequality in society. There were demands about re-regulating the banks because they'd kind of gone off the rails along these lines. Financial activism today looks quite different than it did back in 2010. Financial activism today is increasingly about how the actual institutions that we will build to repair and redesign our financial institutions. So we have different community-based organizations like People's Bank LA and Cooperation Jackson. We also have a good number of think tanks like the Democracy Collaborative, Democracy Next, Roosevelt Institute, Commonwealth, which is in the UK, that are really trying to rethink how do we redesign financial institutions so that they can serve a public good, not just a private good. So in a way, financial activism has become emancipatory. If it was defensive before, it's kind of taken this more like future-oriented goal about actually building institutions. And that's really what my interest is all about. It's all about thinking through what this new kind of financial activism can tell us about the institutions that we should build in place of what we have now. And to get there, this is kind of the outline of the talk that I want to go through. It basically has 3 points. This is essentially kind of the overarch of a book I just published. The first section, I'm going to talk about what finance capitalism is. And I'm going to try to make the argument that a key feature of modern finance capitalism is a profound underinvestment in the things that are socially desirable and needed. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about how the growth of finance capitalism has actually eroded democracy it hasn't just led to economic negatives, it's also led to a political situation in which American politics and democratic politics elsewhere are deeply entrenched and in some ways controlled by financial actors. I'm gonna try to make the argument here that a key reason for that is the particular kinds of assets that finance has. And I'm gonna call this asset power. And then at the end, if I have time to get here and I haven't talked so long, I'm gonna talk about an alternative. Based on the financial activism that we see today, the organizations that I participated in writing this book, I kind of draw out 4 principles for how we might think about democratizing financial systems. And I'm gonna talk about those and kind of lay out how we might think we might create a democratic public bank, for instance. So this is the broad kind of outline of the talk. All right, first, finance capitalism, what is it? Well, of course, there's been tons of books written about this. So there's tons of debates, all sorts of arcane debates within Marxist theory, for instance. But at base, the people tend to agree that finance capitalism is a regime of accumulation in which profits accrue increasingly through financial channels like interest, dividends, capital gains, rather than through trade and commodity production. It's not saying it's only through these things. It's just saying that it's increasingly through these things. So accumulation in finance capitalism is increasingly reliant on these income-producing financial assets, right? And that's just the base kind of way of understanding what finance capitalism is for me. Now, the way in which it's typically been understood in the literature is about how finance has become a growing sector in the economy as a whole. And that's essentially what this graph shows, right? Here we see gross value added as a ratio of the total value added from between different sectors. So you have manufacturing, retail, agriculture, and finance, insurance, and real estate. Typically, FIRE is what how people refer to as finance. And we can see that in the U.S., and you see this story is mimicked elsewhere, like the UK. As a share of the economy as a whole, finance has grown. Now, something that's talked about less, but which I think is equally as important, is the way that finance itself, the growth of finance, has actually transformed people's wealth. So typically people talk about finance, the control of financial assets, as something that principally concerns the elite. And it is true that the vast majority of financial assets are held by the elite. But it's also true that increasingly working class people have their own wealth tied up into financial channels as well. It's small in absolute terms, but it's big in terms of their wealth and what it means to them. And so basically what we see is this is comparing different income groups between 1989 and 2019. And we can see that, okay, my mouse works nice. We can see that if you look at the top 1% between 89 and 2019, they had a 59% growth in their wealth in financial assets. These are stocks and pension fund savings. But similarly, the bottom 50% of income earners also had a significant growth of their wealth in financial assets. So 30%, such that, the bottom 50% of income earners in the US have about 30% of their total wealth, 20% of their total wealth in financial assets, right? Most of their wealth is in homes. This is just to say that ordinary working people, their own wealth is increasingly tied up in this system, right? And we've seen this institutionally with the development of what we now think of as pooled assets, so different forms of institutional investors, which are run by asset managers. In the post-war period, this was really pension funds, private pension funds, public pension funds. That's the green and the pink. But increasingly, it's mutual funds, as well as the assets held by non-financial corporations. So in the 1950s, if you were to look at the stock market, it was almost entirely controlled by American households, individuals. Now it's increasingly controlled by these asset managers, right? These things are these institutions that are playing a really huge growing role in our society. And again, I just want to echo this point. This is not just the wealth of the elite. It's the wealth of ordinary working class Americans, right? And this isn't just an American story, although that's what I'm talking about right now. We see this mimicked, or also taking place in other places. Very similar stories happening right now in the UK. So as we've had this kind of massive growth of these asset managers, again, pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds, private equity firms, they're playing a growing role in investment decisions in our society. The money that's being sloshed around is increasingly money that is managed by asset managers who are hired to manage other people's money, right? And that the way in which they manage that money, because of a combination of fiduciary law and other regulations, and also just the mere pursuit of their own interests, is by acquiring financial assets and extracting the most that they can get out of them in the shortest amount of time. They're not investing this money in ways in what's called slow investment or patient investment, right? They're not trying to help grow industries. They're not trying to help develop businesses. They're trying to acquire and extract as much as they can in the shortest amount of time so that they can maximize their returns. And this has had profoundly negative effects on how we invest, right? It's a major paradox that we live in a moment of a huge amount of financial wealth sloshing around, and also live in a moment of profound underinvestment in housing, profound underinvestment in green technologies and green infrastructures, a profound underinvestment in the development of community wealth. These things are profoundly intertwined. They're not parallel stories that don't have anything to do with each other. They're causally related, because the wealth itself is invested in a way that's designed not to go into these types of investments, because they don't generate as much profits and returns as other types of investments. And we have a good number of books that kind of really lay this. Brett Christopher has one recently about energy investment. The Price is Wrong, I think it's called, which basically shows this, right? It's making this argument, but you can see this paralleled in other areas that require investment as well. Now, it would be bad enough if this was the whole story, but unfortunately, it's not the whole story. There's also a political side of it. Dun, dun, dun. This is in addition to actually kind of keeping investment out of these things we need, this transformation, right? The transformation of ordinary people's wealth that's being tied up, increasingly funneled into these asset managers, has also eroded democratic processes. And I'm at the second part of my talk. So in the book, The Master's Tools, which is an obvious riff off the Audre Lorde, I argue that there are three kind of key mechanisms that financial actors, principally asset managers, use to influence state policy. And undergirding each of those mechanisms is what I call asset power. It's the capacity that allows them to do these things, that derives from what is so unique about a financial asset. So I'm going to try to go through each of these kind of briefly, and then talk a little bit about asset power, and then I'll get to the maybe the more the exciting ending, positive start of the story. So 2/3 of this talk are negative and sad and et cetera, but 1/3 is actually quite positive. So you have something to look forward to, I think. All right, on to the negative. The first I call engagement. And this is very simply, it's we were talking earlier, it's the Domhoff argument, right? It's the way in which financial actors and institutions actively organize in politics, right? It's through interlocking directorates and business associations. It's through spending on lobbying and campaign contributions. And no other sector of American business spends more in politics than the financial sector. This is at all levels. We're not just talking about presidential elections, things like that. Huge spenders in politics, and they're doing that because they know they're going to get something out of it. We see in the kind of the kerfuffle around the tariffs, We can see the way that as Trump's tariffs started to get put in place, the financial sector key actors immediately started lobbying the state so that their particular interests were protected in the particular ways those tariffs were put in place, right? They initiated their engagement power and got what they wanted. It'll be bad enough were that the end of the story, but it's not. A second way in which the financial sector derives power in politics, in the book I call entanglement. And this is the way that the financial sector itself is embedded in both the state, which I won't talk about, but also in non-financial firms, which I will talk about for time reasons. So think about non-financial firms, right? These are firms that are essentially engaged in manufacturing, agricultural production, services, maybe they make chemicals, whatever the case might be, retail. We think of these as firms that aren't themselves financial firms, but in fact, these firms are financial firms because they are increasingly intertwined in the system of finance. On the largest firms, the big firms, increasingly derive profits from financial channels. This is everything from speculation to also offering financial services. If you've ever been on a flight and been offered a credit card, this is what I'm talking about. But then on the other side of the ledger, small and medium-sized firms, in the US, these are incredibly indebted right now. And they're incredibly dependent on financial sources of income to continue to manage themselves and to continue to grow. And so this intertwining actually then activates the lobbying power and the influence power of these other sectors of non-financial firms for finance. So what we find is there's some interesting studies that look at lobbying, and when you see a bill that's put before the Congress, and it's a bill that's aimed at regulating finance, for instance, no other type of regulation is protested by other sectors of business more than financial regulations, right? So if but ag is going to get, well, financial firms are like, do what you want. But like the regulations that are aimed principally at the financial sector are lobbied against by non-financial sectors, right? Which suggests that the financial sector has a kind of hegemonic role in society. It is so deeply embedded in all these other sectors of business. It is in some ways the leading sector. Other sectors are dependent on it doing well for them to do well. So it's entangled in the economy as a whole. And the third I call prominence, and this is basically, related to the idea of too big to fail. It's somewhat connected to what I just said, but because the financial sector is playing this growing role in the economy, because so many people, their wealth is dependent on it, even if it's just, you have typically much more than this, but even imagine, like 20-somethings, teenagers are invested in, increasingly in meme stocks or something like that. You have Robinhood on your phone, you're checking it. It has like a normative effect on how you think about finance, even if it's like a $250 or something. It shapes what you think about it. So there's this growing prominence in the economy as a whole, such that everybody's interests seem to be tied up in this thing, right? Even if it's kind of it's not significant, oftentimes it is. People see their interests as tied up in financial markets. So this makes it so politicians are less likely to ever want to go after finance, not even just because of the lobbying, because they know that if finance does bad, then they're going to actually, the electorate's going to get hurt. They'll get voted out of office. So we have these three kind of distinct channels. Now, undergirding this is this thing I call asset power. Typically, critical theorists of the state, people who are bringing critical theory to bear on politics, have thought about the power of capitalists in a very abstract way, right? Capitalists have the capacity to invest and disinvest, and that gives them certain capacities in politics because of that. The mere control over how our society invests, the net total of it. But I think it's important in some ways to think more concretely about how different sectors of business have unique forms of power, given the kinds of assets that they control. You can think of some assets as being quite fixed, right? Agriculture, you can't move a field, right? It's literally there. A firm with you have a factory, that's harder to move. It's movable, but it's hard. Finance is unique because it is incredibly mobile. It's as easy as going click. It can quickly, a financial asset can quickly be dissolved and another one bought, right? And you can quickly exchange a financial asset across the world. If we ever go to Mars, you can even do it across space. And in addition to that, financial assets are quite liquid. That means that you could just turn it into cash, like right now. Like you don't have to wait a few months to go through the whole process. You can just sell it, right? And this gives the financial sector a unique power, like the ability to quickly move its money out of a firm, out of a territory, out of a state, and the liquidity, the way in which cash can quickly be, financial assets can quickly be turned to cash, give these actors, these asset managers, a pretty big threat to be able to wield in politics. So when they're lobbying, they say, look, we're going to disinvest. We're going to move the financial assets elsewhere. When it comes to the way in which they're entangled with non-financial firms, they say, look, the debt that we're going to issue is not going to be as good if you're supporting this, right? We're going to cut back on that. The ways in which their prominence in the economy as a whole is exerted. They again can it's all about the mobility, the ability to kind of punish a political territory or actor by kind of withdrawing investment as a whole. So the asset power is an important source of political power in finance capitalism. It's an important kind of dimension of our modern political reality, and it's also an important site for political contestation. That is, people understand this. It's not just the asset managers that get this. I was at University of Chicago 2 summers ago, or last summer, I don't know. Time is a blur. And it was a conference about planning. And in the middle of the conference, we hear a crash. And we go outside, and the picture to the right is the picture that I took in this very moment. We go outside, and the building next to us is being broken into by a group of student activists. It's a building that houses an institute run by David Axelrod, and the students are occupying it, which they do for a period. I didn't stay for the whole occupation. I had to go. But the point was that they wanted the university to disinvest from corporations that were directly profiting from the genocide in Gaza. They understand that there's asset power. They understand that investment shapes politics, and they understand it as a site of contention. Several years ago at Marquette University, which is where I taught for a while, right after the Hurricane Maria, I don't know if folks remember in Puerto Rico, right? After Hurricane Maria, there's this hedge fund called Baupost Group, which is run by Seth Klarman. If you ever go to Harvard, you'll see lots of buildings that have Klarman on them. And Baupost Group held a huge amount of Puerto Rican debt. And in the wake of the Hurricane Maria, it sent down representatives to the Puerto Rican government, who then pressured the government to sell off public schools, to sell off its public energy company, and to sell off different forms of public infrastructure so that that debt could be repaid. And that's precisely what they did, right? And students in that moment knew this is what was happening and put pressure on their universities to disinvest from Baupost Group. Turns out that many universities, their own endowments, are invested in this. So this is a key site of political contestation, right? The transformations that we've seen with finance capitalism have changed politics in this way, in a way that weren't quite true, right? 30, 40 years ago. Okay. All right, I think I'm doing okay. If I'm not, just somebody flag me and say you're not doing okay. All right. So now for the positive conclusion. Democratic ruptures. All right. So I hope that what I've said so far, I've never really directly said it, but I hope that what I've said so far kind of suggests something. And it suggests that a key problem that we have is that we have these massive financial institutions that allocate money in ways that ordinary people have no say over, right? That is a key, that's kind of like the key thing to understand in the story, right? That's kind of been hidden the whole time, but that's the thing, right? It turns out we have these huge pools of assets that have huge social consequences that nobody has any say over, except for asset managers who are following these laws that were passed in the 1920s and the 1970s. So the question is, how do we change that? Like, how do we create institutions in which ordinary people can actually have some democratic control over how their own wealth, or better yet, other people's wealth, is actually allocated? And this gets to the question of democratic control. It turns out there are folks already thinking about this. There's a quite robust public bank movement in California and also in New York. I don't know about Wisconsin. You have work to do. You have work to do. But there's also some pretty robust institutions and think tanks that are trying to design these kind of systems of thinking about how we can create kind of democratic financial assets. And this has also kind of reached kind of the top levels of government. So in 2023, Rashida Tlaib put forward a piece of legislation called the Public Banking Act. It was a revision of a Public Banking Act that she put forward in 2020. And in the 2023 version, there's an explicit designs for democratic governance. The 2020 version, it was just like, just let state managers do it, elected appointees, but the 2023 version has an explicit design for how can we incorporate citizen voice. So what I'm going to go into now. Okay, good. And you can see that I'm paranoid. It's hidden beneath the surface. Like what I'm gonna go into now is essentially some design principles for thinking about how we could actually democratize finance. And I won't really kind of get into this, so I'll keep it kind of abstract just because of time. But I'm kind of taking these design principles out from what different activist groups and policymakers are actually trying to do, right? So like these aren't just things that I'm kind of like coming up with myself. It's actually kind of related to what people are trying to do in these organizations. Okay. Gonna get well. All right. So the first design principle is the idea of subsidiarity, and this is taken from different types of Catholic social teaching. It goes back. It goes really far, it goes back hundreds of years. But the basic idea here is when thinking about how to design a institution of finance that can be democratic, at what scale should you be thinking about, right? Should it just be a municipal bank, or should it just be something small? Should it be like the public bank of the US? Should it be like a global bank or something, right? And the principle of subsidiarity basically says that when you're designing a new institution, between kind of relatively similar choices, choose the smaller one, and choose the scale appropriate to the problem you're trying to fix. If you're trying to fix housing problems in Madison, maybe you need some sort of pool of finance that's just in Madison. If you're trying to fix something as big as climate change, maybe you need something at a much larger scale. So subsidiarity is basically saying, look, we're going to have multiple interconnected, overlapping financial organizations that are trying to solve particular problems, right? That's the first principle, subsidiarity. Okay, so once you create this thing, Well, who should be taking part in governing it? Right? It's the question of who are the demos? Who gets to vote? Right now, that question is solved by shareholders, right? The people who own the thing are the people that get to vote. But there's an important principle in political philosophy called the principle of affected interest, which says that the people who participate in an organization to make decisions about what it does should be the people that whose interests are deeply affected by those organizations. Now, what we have now is a system in which vast numbers of organizations make decisions that deeply affect us, but are nonetheless not controlled in any way, shape, or form by us, right? Precisely because what we think of as democracy is restrained to a certain set of political institutions. But if you follow the political philosopher Carol Pateman, in fact, institutions in industry, institutions in finance, institutions in education, and elsewhere should also be thought of as political institutions too. And so the affected interest principle tries to think through, okay, how do we have this vast number of institutions doing all sorts of different things. Like, how do we decide who runs these things? And this says it should be run by the people that are affected by them. The picture, what you see is basically smokestacks in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. There's an energy company, which is located right in the center of the city. It bifurcates the poorest neighborhoods of the city, Latino to the north, Black to the south. And for decades, I don't know, not 100 years, but definitely decades, it was run by coal. And those neighborhoods were negatively affected. And there was for many years a movement to try to get the power plant to convert from coal to clean energy, which was not successful for many years, precisely because the people most affected by the coal plant, the energy plant, had no actual voice over how that thing ran, right? Eventually it was converted. And now there's a campaign in Milwaukee, which is run by DSA and some other organizations that are actually trying to convert We Energies into a public utility. Okay, so that is the second. Okay, the third. This is my favorite, and in some ways the one that I think is most important. Well, maybe it's not the most important, but it's my favorite. Does anybody know what that is?
A claritarian.
What's your name?
Will.
Will, you nailed it. And can you describe what a claritarian is?
Like how it functions? All I remember is that basically, at least for juries, they had these little tiles that they put in one end and then it like randomly spit it out on the other side. And depending on how, I forget if it's the color, I think, or which side, you either were selected for jury duty or not.
Okay. But the key thing is the randomness.
Yes.
Right? Because it was designed, it was a excellent response, Will. It was designed basically to create a random selection process. And during the period of radical democracy in Athens, I mean, this is by no means, this is, I'm not trying to make the claim, this is a perfect world, right? Slaves were excluded. That was like 2/3 of society. Women were excluded. That was like half. The math isn't adding up, but like the key thing is that like almost every aspect of Athenian society for a period of like almost 100 years was governed through small groups of people that were selected at random. It wasn't just juries. It was like everything. This was everything from the people who like maintain the temples after they had their festivals, to the people who like maintain roads, to the people who maintain prices in the market. Like they had like prices being fixed. Like if you wanted to hire a person to come to your party to play the harp, you could be sure that they weren't price gouging you, because that price was actually fixed by a randomly selected group of people to make decisions about it. It turns out that this basic technique of selecting people, as opposed to what we do now, which is voting people in, right, has actual incredible positive effects and promise for democratic deliberation. So first, what we find is through some different interesting cognitive studies, we find that if you get a group of randomly selected folks together, or even ignore the random selection, if you just get a group of diverse people together who come from different backgrounds, who are demographically diverse, and you ask them to solve a problem, which they have the tools to solve, they are much better at solving problems than if you get a group of people together who are demographically very similar, but maybe cognitively very intelligent. So think of just like having a group of people like here, Harvard economists, deciding how should we invest. And you're like a Madison Public Bank, the studies I think actually tell us you might get better decisions out of just a randomly selected group of people from Madison than a group of Harvard economists, right? Because they can see things from different angles. It's like the elephant problem, like they're seeing things from different angles. They're thinking about problems from different perspectives. They're generating better decisions. We're able, in addition to that, we're able to actually undermine elite influence in these processes because through random selection, in effect, you're over-selecting people who are not elites. Elites mathematically are a small number of people, right? If you do a random selection process, you can kind of undermine their influence in these processes. And you can also shape these decision-making or these selection processes through sampling techniques that allow you to make sure that there's representation from different groups, like minority groups in society who mathematically might be underselected. So we have this process of selecting people, bringing them together to deliberate, to think about different things, to think about how mandates for finance might be created. There's an additional positive to this. We obviously live in a polarized society in which it seems, there's every other year there's a movie about another potential civil war in the U.S. What we find is through some of the new social science around this stuff, and political scientists are loving these processes because it's like a new thing to study, is that ordinary people, if you tell them that a decision was made by a group of ordinary people like them, randomly selected, they tend to see that as having a lot of legitimacy. Much more so than if you were to say like, X person from your local business association said this. X person from this activist organization said this. X person from this elected leader said this. People see these processes as legitimate in terms of what they produce because they see them in a way as not being kind of bought off from the beginning. So how do we bring people together out of that affected group? Random selection, bringing them together to deliberate over how we might allocate finance socially. Okay, I'm kind of, am I kind of 13 minutes. What we see basically is that there are a ton of these processes being used increasingly. So really they take off an explosion after the financial crisis. This is the number basically worldwide. This is from the OECD. Worldwide, the number of randomly selected citizen assembly processes that have been happening, right, over the past, couple decades. We've seen them all over the world. Some of the most notable examples are in Ireland several years ago. An assembly was brought together to think about the constitutional bans on abortion and gay marriage in Ireland. Over several weekends, the assembly discussed and deliberated these issues. They eventually made the recommendations that they should not be banned. And the Irish Parliament took those recommendations serious and changed the constitution on those issues. But they've been put together on a wide range of different things. So in France, you were mentioning end of life stuff. They had like end of life discussions about euthanasia. and elsewhere, they've been used for things as, not just these big contentious issues, but that's how politicians think they might be useful, but also things like urban development, kind of in some ways, they're used in more mundane ways as well. So we have kind of lots of examples of these things in practice, and I'm happy to talk more in depth about how they actually work. Okay, I'll try not to spend too much time on Machiavelli, as this might seem like completely from left field. But as increasingly in political theory, and you kind of see this come up in the different proposals that different activist groups are putting forward, although it's not put in these terms. Public Bank LA isn't debating Machiavelli, but you see in political theory that there's been this kind of new embrace of Machiavellian insights about democracy, and in particular, there's a book by John P. McCormick at University of Chicago on this. And what the insight is, people typically think about Machiavelli as this like cunning advisor to statesmen. How do you ruthlessly get ahead? Inspiration for Tupac lyrics and things like that. But what the insight is that actually Machiavelli had a quite robust theory of democracy, and a big part of it was in the creation of institutions that were class-based institutions for the working classes, plebeians. And he had in some of his designs essentially the idea that one should create plebeian institutions that can serve as a check on sort of these institutions of the elite, right? And that's where you get the idea of agonism, right? Our political institutions should actually create like kind of these fights between kind of groups that should be there, but nonetheless obviously have different interests. So that's the third. How do you incorporate this into public finance? How do we create a Machiavellian institution of some sort? Okay, these are my 4 principles. I'm now going to start to wrap it up with the simplest slide of them all. All right, how might we put these ideas into an actual institutional design? In the red is a traditional bank. You have the board of banking experts, and they're basically hiring and managing the different operational divisions of the bank who are trying to achieve the bank's different mandates, organized principally around rates of return and profits. Pretty simple setup. The 2 things I want to focus on, there's lots going on here, and if you think the devil's in the details, you could read this chapter. But the two I want to focus on briefly are the People's Assembly and these plebeian or issue-based commissions. So, how do we think about how to allocate democratic finance? Well, one way of doing that is through randomly selected assemblies that create mandates for the bank's portfolios and programs, right? And these assemblies could be drawn from some population. It might be Madison, it might be Wisconsin, it could be the US, it could be the world, it could be your neighborhood if you want a really, really small one. And they're brought together to debate and deliberate over what the bank should be doing with its resources. And it creates basically mandates for investment, given certain guidelines, right? So maybe the bank will have to have some rate of return. So that will have, however that's designed will shape this, like the guidelines. So that creates mandates, creates democratic mandates. Now, one way in which you can kind of build in that kind of agonism, those checks, is by creating commissions which have different purposes. So we might, for instance, have a green energy commission or a climate change commission, which has veto power over the mandates with respect to the issue of climate change. Right? Maybe the assembly makes decisions that kind of violate in some ways the goal of green transition, and that commission might say, "Nah, that particular thing undermines our goal. We want to essentially veto that." Or you might, in a place like Madison or Wisconsin, where there's incredible racial inequities in housing and in occupations, you might have a racial equity commission, which is thinking about like the equity impact of different forms of investing. And that might have mandates. You could think of others as well, maybe a labor commission and so on. So, but this would basically build into the bank's design the not only robust democratic representation from ordinary people who are drawn at random, who are deliberating over things, but also representation of different commissions that have specific goals that society decides about, right? That maybe it's Wisconsin decides, or whatever relative political unit decides. And these basically create these mandates for the bank that the bank can then pursue through its programs. And this is just focused on the bank, but we might focus it on other things as well, right? Something that I've studied a lot is pensions, and we might think about democratizing pension funds in similar ways. And actually, we have some interesting examples of where things like this are being used to democratize pension funds. But I won't fully go into it. Now, this is basically the minimalist version, right? Like, what if we just democratize one bank? Let's see how it goes. One thing, right? In the maximalist version, we're thinking about how do you democratize all of these institutions, not just set up a new one, but actually convert these different financial institutions into democratic institutions through these various mechanisms. Or you could be even more maximalist and say, why stop at financial institutions? Let's democratize everything, right? We're now we're going from like the realm of actual practical policy into the realm of sci-fi, but I nonetheless think that it's important to still think about that, right? My ambition, or what I think is most desirable, to use one of Wright's terms, is I mean, he didn't come up with the term desirable, but desirability is one of the three. Desirability, achievability. What was the third? Viability. Is a maximalist version of democratized finance, but the achievability question is maybe one more thought about at the level of the minimalist version, right? Actually, just establishing a public bank. Okay, but I will leave it there. That's the end of my talk.
I've got one, which is like, my question is, are we too focused on finance here for the process of democratization, especially in a world where the structures of finance are so tied up in the American context and by extension, the global context and the structures of domination and empire? How do we kind of navigate the fact that these financial institutions and these like tools of finance are so fundamentally intertwined with global structures of extraction and domination? If we democratize finance here, does that not just create the world of the Athenian polis with the slaves left out in the rest of the periphery?
Do you like to take another question, or do you want to take one?
However you prefer.
You? Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I would say, well, there's two. Maybe let me just say something historically and then kind of speak directly to your point. This is not something that the kind of characterization of finance capitalism that I give in the talk is not something that just happened behind our backs. Like it's something that has a deeply it's a product of a deeply contentious history about how pools of finance are governed, and it kind of goes back to the New Deal period in the U.S., in the post-war period in particular, when you had the establishment of collectively bargained pension funds. And during that period, essentially, it was many unions, although not all, thought that if you fought for private pensions in addition to private healthcare through collectively bargained agreements, that capital would support a more robust welfare state because individual capitals would basically say, I don't want to incur the additional cost. Isn't it better if we just have a public program? So then the cost can be spread and I don't have to pay for pensions. It turns out that American firms were more anti-communist than they were cost saving. And that was not the case, right? The firms were more hostile to the idea of universal health care than they were to privately collectively bargained healthcare plans, for instance. So basically, without going too deep into this, you get the establishment of pensions and pension funds. And immediately, once you have this happen, unions in America recognize that these are massive, they're going to be massive pools of power that one, if they controlled, could invest in ways that could be potentially extraordinarily pro-union and pro-social. So in the funds in which firms gained some footing of control, they invested in ways that into things like worker housing, into projects that were essentially took into consideration the labor impacts, various construction projects and things like that. For weird reasons, it was actually in the building trades sectors where they had most control. So this is just to say that there's been a contentious history of how these funds have been controlled, and one in which, in those moments where unions have gained some control, they've tended to try to use them in ways that help labor. Not all. There's been some shadiness, like with the Teamsters Central States pension funds in the 1960s, but usually. Now, what we have now, going specifically to your question, is a situation in which the members of the global periphery, right, have no say whatsoever over how these pools of investment are allocated, and additionally, in addition to having no say, are the bearers of the negative effects of how those funds are allocated, because the people that are investing in them are not considering their interests at all, right? In fact, there's, to use another right term, there's an inverse interdependent relation between their interest and the interest of the managers, because they're trying to find places to invest where they can extract the most, right? And typically that's if you're investing into companies, that's in companies that are using the cheapest labor, right? So what I think this offers is a way to incorporate the interests of people outside of those funds, right? And that's the affected interest principle. And so if that means that those funds are invested in ways that are directly impacting the interest of people that are non-beneficiaries, right? In this case, the people that aren't going to get the payout of the fund, then those people should have some voice too, right? Going to the principle of affected interest. Yeah, so that's kind of how I would think about it. I don't know. Does that address what you were saying? Do you think?
Yeah, I think generally I just would add the, I guess, point about the contention in the unions, like the connection between the unions and American imperialism abroad, with AFL-CIO's support for the CIA's intervention in a number of different imperial peripheries as well. So it problematizes even labor's involvement in the attempts to democratize things in the U.S. as being often at the expense of those abroad.
No doubt. But I think what this opens the door to, it's no guarantee on that issue. We don't know what decisions will be made in advance by citizen assemblies, right? You can't just presume that everything that they do is going to be somehow fit your vision of like how the world should look. But what they at least open the door to is having those decisions made in ways by a more reflective, deliberative process, where I think it's more likely that these kinds of issues would be incorporated into the decision than under the current framework. That's kind of how I think about it.
Thanks.
Before I take some questions in the room, I'm going to take some questions from online. Some of them are very specific, asking for further details. Others broader. So Mike Randall asks, in allowing for random groups of people to make financial decisions, what do you do if they suffer from widespread economic illiteracy? What if they don't understand compound interest, for example, or the concept of externalities from investments? Can they make informed decisions that are then passed on to this board of experts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it gets in some ways to what a lot of the debates are in the different organizations that are essentially running these citizen assembly processes. So one of the key things, let me just say this. When you run a citizen assembly, you don't just grab a bunch of random people and just throw them into a room and be like, hey, come up with something. They have to be facilitated by people who are kind of experts at it and who give individuals the information they need to make a decision, right? And that means that there is both a learning process and a deliberative process in these assemblies, right? It's not just like getting people together, they yell about stuff, and then they vote. You have to actually learn about the options, learn about the decision that you have in front of you, and then kind of go through the process of having a discussion and coming to a common agreement. And so they have been used in ways in which people are able to learn about an issue in order to make an informed agreement. Think about what we have now. What we have now is we vote for people, and we're voting for people based on their policy positions on all the issues. So actually right now, we're expected to know everything about everything as voters, right? And it turns out that we don't, right? It turns out that people vote for people who kind of feel more close to them, or rhetorically they're saying things that kind of align with kind of what I think. Maybe they have some policy issues that I kind of understand, but I don't know anything about taxation. So yeah, sure. What this offers is the possibility of cognitive divisions of labor in society, where certain people are actually, ordinary people are learning in depth about things and then making reasoned judgment about them. But I don't have to learn about that thing. I'm doing I'm maybe a part of another assembly that's learning about some other thing, right? And that actually is the heart of what democracy is all about. There's this classic, it is classic. It's by definition classic. It's from Aristotle. Democracy is to govern and be governed in return, is what Aristotle says in the Politics, which is getting at what I'm saying right now, right? Democracy is about sort of having your time to make decisions, but also stepping back and letting other people making decisions and living with it, right? It's everybody being able to actually participate in those decisions, but also not having to be a part of all the decisions. So yeah, I think that gets to the question. The other thing I would add to that, I don't want to talk so long, but the other thing I want to add to that, as briefly as I possibly can, is that there's lots of debates about how you facilitate these assembly processes in ways in which the experts, the facilitators, are not influencing the decision. Right? That's like a key issue. Like you can design one of these things in ways where you're trying to get people to make a certain decision. But there's huge debates and kind of emerging best practices in this field about how you don't do that, right? How do you do it in which people both have the information to make decisions, but also are not influenced in their decisions by the people that are setting up the whole process from the beginning. And that's just, it's a matter of facilitation design.
Okay, since we have a number of questions now in the room, great job, guys. I'm going to take the two questions that we have online. One question in the room, have you come back. One question online, questions in the room, come back again. Okay, great. So Sonia writes, how will this democratization deal with questions of migration? Moment to think about today. Who will get to decide? Who will be the ones that are eligible to participate? What if the most affected populations are migrants when they aren't allowed to participate in the decision-making process? Thank you, Sonia. And then Greg asks, This seems to be, or states, this seems to be a highly reformed capitalist system that you're proposing. Should I assume I'm wrong and the workers actually control the means of production, or is this a variant of the investing in capitalist enterprise via public decisions? And
Can I add something that I think is connected to that?
Lola.
Sorry, because I was thinking, so maybe when I was hearing you, Mike, I was thinking about like non-reformist reforms, right? Like, okay, like are these non-reformist reforms? But in some ways, like where is, like, let's play with your utopia. Like, where is this horizon going? Like, let's play with your maximalist view of how we, because part of this, I guess my question has to do with time. These non-reformist reforms are only viable if people, and let's think about people, let's jump over the hard questions of who we select or whatever, need to have time to participate. And none of the system allows for that. There is no time. Like we all struggle, even like in labor organizations, to get people to meetings, to get people to spaces for discussion. And we're envisioning this like big assemblies or big chunks of time for debate. But play with me.
Democracy Fridays.
Democracy Fridays? Okay.
That's the argument.
And I was like, what's the game?
That's the argument. This is my playful response, but also serious.
No,
In the book, I argue that, all right, Max, we're in the maximalist version.
yes, we're like going
We're like fully democratized,
internationally.
yeah, we're fully democratized society. Everybody's got, their phones are blowing up with all these different invitations to, the idea is basically, what if we create a day out of the week, which is essentially a day for democracy, and people are paid to participate. So essentially, right, like your Fridays are always kind of doing this. Like, it's your Fridays. I'm sorry. That's what it means to be a part of this society. Your Fridays are basically going to be engaged in democratic deliberation and discussion around some area, right? Like, oh God, I'm on the sewage assembly again. But that's the idea, right? You have these, in this maximalist version, you have like a certain set amount of time. In the minimalist version, typically people are paid in the different assemblies that have happened. They're like paid, and they usually do it for 4 to 5 weekends. It's like you do it on a full day on a Saturday for like 4 to 5 weekends, not necessarily even back-to-back weekends. It might be once a month. Gives you time to like think about the issue when you're not there. But the key thing, I think, in both the minimalist and the maximalist version is some form of payment to basically, which, I mean, why not? We're not paid to do, democracy should be a job, right? So that's kind of the idea. And it is explicitly a non-reformist reform. In the book, I use the term democratic rupture in place of, it's kind of like my version of what a non-reformist reform is, because I think the key issue, and not just in finance, but in the workplace and, I don't know, in the university, wherever it might be, in all these systems that are basically governed through as private entities and driven by profit needs, the key issue is democracy. The key issue is giving voice to people whose interests are affected by these organizations. And so I see democratic reforms as, democratic ruptures. I use ruptures instead of reforms because it's actually, I think, growing democracy. This is kind of, I'm mentioning Eric Wright a lot, but it is kind of like a Wrightian idea of like, capitalism is a kind of ecology where there's like capitalist stuff going on over here, and then you have like the library, public library, and it's about kind of growing those spaces for me, not of public goods versus private goods, but democratic institutions, right? So for me, like what's key in like the rupture or the non-reformist reform is not making something public. The public-private divide, in my view, is a kind of I mean, obviously, it's obviously there are public things and private things. I'm not disputing that, but there's a proclivity among progressives to put everything in these two things. Like public things good, private things bad. But that in some ways I think is like this lingering Cold War idea, and that when actually you have a robust understanding of the state, lots of public things are quite bad, right? Because public things are too run by elites, right? And that actually the key third category is the demos, right? The working class majority who don't run public or private things, right? And so how do you build the power of that group? And that to me is what like the democratic rupture is all about, and expanding it out. On migration, I think it's a really important question. Increasingly in these debates, like even the phrase citizens assembly is itself, that's what I use just because it's intuitive, but is itself a contentious phrase because people say, well, citizens, that then excludes a bunch of people who are not. And that's the position I hold. Like other people would say residents assemblies or just people's assemblies, such that the people that are included in deliberative processes are residents of areas, not necessarily citizens of states. And that is something that I fundamentally support. And who those residents are, that's, that changes with migration patterns. It's based on a robust consensus that kind of helps us know who to select from. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
Please call people. You're doing okay. Hands, please. Okay, Will and Michael.
So one common criticism of using lotteries is, at least for like legislative institutions, is that they're just going to get captured by the bureaucracy because the bureaucracy has a high level of expertise. They're often in these positions for a long time. And the value of lotteries requires a high level of rotation through often, Athens did it for like a year or something, right? And one worry you might have with the financial institutions is that you're going to face a similar kind of worry in that given how complex financial institutions are, especially as they become international, you're going to have this problem of this when there's like a conflict between, if I understood your model correctly, right? The kind of lottery selected people are kind of setting the ends of the financial institutions, and then the experts are like kind of pursuing the means. Mm-hmm. And the worry then is that one is that distinction is in practice not as sharp as people often want it to be. If the experts say we can't do this, like this is just not a feasible end to pursue, like what should the lottery selected institution do with that information, right? Like in one sense, like who are they to say they can't or they can? And then another thing you can do, of course, is like drag the experts to kind of drag their feet on these things and like kind of hope for a better next pool of people. This is Landon Pevnick's criticism of lotteries, is that a lot of these more stable non-democratic institutions are just going to constantly drag their feet. And they do this with elected officials already, right? And that's assuming, right, kind of a higher level of continuity with legislatures. And so I guess I'm curious to hear what you think about how to manage that tension in these kinds of expert positions where there's just a fundamental information asymmetry. And it seems like the lottery selected people are not in the advantageous side of that asymmetry.
Michael.
Yeah, I guess in the spirit of completing the desirability, viability, achievability triad, I did have a sort of achievability question around your discussion of asset power, the second part of your presentation, in which you argued, I think, perfectly convincingly that finance is sort of a hegemonic sector in capital, and that if you look at, for example, all these manufacturing firms in the manufacturing sector, how heavily financialized it is, how much they're tied in with financial firms, how much they're making money on their own financial services that they've engaged in, and so on. I'm just sort of wondering, so, the kind of, I guess, like boilerplate thing about hegemony is that there's always cracks, right? It's always contested. And so I'm wondering if you could expand on or give examples of ways that there are like elite splits between finance and manufacturing. Is there some way that like manufacturing firms find their sort of like manufacturing sides, so to speak, like undermined by finance, that might produce some kind of, if you squint, like some kind of potential constituency among sort of manufacturing capitalists for kind of reducing the power of finance, for example. So that's one question. And I guess along similar lines, I guess that's the entanglement question. Then there was the preponderance, prominence. What was the third one? Prominence. To me, and I guess I remember the story there being about just like how much finance is like kind of now baked into like normal people's lives in this kind of way where you like everybody can be sort of a retail trader. You got like the meme stock guys and stuff like that who are just like normal gamer dudes or whatever. I anecdotally, like, and I don't have a well-formed thought on this, but anecdotally, I feel like when in the sort of like GameStop meme stock moment and like the AMC stock moment, there was like this kind of like bubbling up of like, oh, we're like the little guys, like we're like the sort of small traders, and we have some kind of like
People's power kind of.
yeah, and we have some kind of antagonistic relationship with big traders. And so I'm wondering if there's like kind of a split there as well, any sort of like democratic impulse involved with like this kind of sort of prominence dynamic, or if these people are all just sort of like the kind of classic temporarily embarrassed millionaire who themselves want to become big traders someday, whatever. So I guess those are my questions, are about like, do you see like cracks opening up in this kind of like hegemony of finance moment, like the sort of contradictions they face as they become sort of a bigger player, a sort of hegemonic player in the sort of overall picture of capitalist governance?
Yeah, super useful. Should I jump? Should I take one? Fast? You're like, come on. Really, really fast. I don't want to endure the punishment of the chair. The first question on bureaucratic capture. This is one where I do go into this in the book a little bit, and I'm looking at my screen because I'm looking at the graph, which is no longer on the slides. But
We can put it back up.
sure,
You just have to share again. I just put it done before.
I feel like I'm already going too long.
Don't worry about it.
Let me say there's two parts, two different institutions that I try to introduce in this kind of larger scheme of a democratized bank that try to address this issue. The one is basically having a standing assembly that's refilled with new people on certain timeframes. That is basically like a research jury, where you're like researching. It's set up to research areas for potential importance for the bank's investment or the fund's investment, and it basically can submit research reports to the assembly for like, maybe you should invest in this. Maybe you should talk about this a little more. To build in kind of some like a bit of a democratic feedback between assemblies. The other thing in terms of like the oversight issue of the banking experts that are basically running it, the bank itself, is the potential of a review board, which would be set up to issue public facing like social impact reports. Right, and audits, right? So if the bank is basically run by people who are mismanaging it and not pursuing the mandates, this would be like to let that be known publicly and to the assembly. So those are the kind of institutional, things that I'm trying to build into it to address that issue. But there's no doubt about it. That's always a possibility. Like, we shouldn't be Pollyanna-ish about it, right? Like, there's always the possibility that it's going to be taken over by bureaucrats. The problem is now it's already like our financial system's already taken over. Like, we could have something that might get taken over, or the thing that already is taken over. So I see it as kind of like it's possible. Like, we want to build in checks, but the possibility is not doesn't make me less excited about it. On the issue of potential cracks, I guess I would say this. The thing that really set off this whole moment that we're living through, the capitalism's dark ages, in my opinion, this might come out of left field, was the Volcker shocks in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which created the environment in which the financial sector could grow. And during the context of the Volcker shocks, which if folks don't know about it, you should go read about it. It's really interesting, and features all sorts of funny characters. Essentially, American capital was opposed to it. The only sector of capital that was like fully for it was Wall Street. And in the context of those shocks, there was not just ordinary people who were like, dude, we're losing our jobs. What are you doing? Different sectors of capital were like, protesting. So like famously, bricks were mailed to the Federal Reserve by building trades firms, and people went there with tractors to kind of protest and things like that. The sector of capital that I think could be most won over in something like this is precisely those kinds of sectors that are like dependent on growing the production side in order to grow their profits. And that's where I see like the different building sectors, building trades, as being kind of key. Like if a key source of funding or a key objective of funding in a democratic pool of finances, for instance, housing, well then privately, like those firms that are like doing the building, those businesses are going to benefit from that, right? Because they're going to be getting financing to do those projects. So those are the sectors where I think you can kind of win over, right? In some ways, at least in the minimalist version. On the can I say one? It's going to be hard for me to say this one briefly.
Can we take two more questions then?
Sure.
I just want to make sure we have these two questions who've been sitting online for about 15 minutes. Sorry, y'all. Viren Murti notes that subsidiary affected interest and autocratic deliberation could be ideal, but both finance and other forms of capitalism have different criteria about how one determines results. What people from Madison see as better might not be what a CEO in New York judges as more profitable. Based on these remarks, two questions. What changes because of finance capital with respect to the tensions between capitalism and democracy? Have things become worse and yet somehow created new democratic possibilities? Do you have any thoughts on how to go from democratizing a couple of banks to larger forms of democratization? Thank you, Bahrain. And then Gabe Khan writes, thanks for the great talk. In your book, you discussed the problem capital strikes as a key justification to democratization. He's quite worried that this would still be a massive problem under more minimalist projects and democratization you describe. What would you say to the claim that the more maximalist democratization is actually, a la Eric Wright, the more achievable utopia, as it would remove the threat of the capital strike?
Okay.
Accomplish those.
All right, I will, and I will do it by way through the question about AMC stuff. So the meme stock stuff and all the discussion in that moment around democratizing finance, right? The phrase is in the ether because of that moment. Was basically building on a view of democracy that I find, to put it nicely, deeply impoverished. So there's kind of a famous book that came out in the 2011 or something by Yale financial economist Robert Shiller, called Finance in the Good Society. And basically he argues that the key problem of the financial system is that a minority of people are gaining all the benefits of the growth, while majority don't have their wealth tied up in it, right? Like it's because you have your money in savings that you're not as rich as that other person. You need to put your money in the stock market, right? And so the Shiller's idea was that democratizing finance is about democratizing access to those markets, right? Like it's access to playing that game, right? And that's what the meme stock stuff was about. It was about like, look, there's this thing happening. It's the hedge funds get to play the game. We don't get to play the game. And look, actually, we can actually shape the game. Like, right? Like we can, and that's what's giving us power. That's fine. Like if you want to get rich that way, that's cool. Like, I wish I would have brought AMC at a certain point, but it's not democracy. Like democracy is like classically understood and by any reasonable standard about making collective decisions over things that affect us collectively, right? That it's about decision-making power, which necessarily involves a collective, right? And that's the kind of the mode of that I think is so different from like the AMC stuff. And it's not about access; it's about decision-making power through deliberation. To Viren's point, very briefly, the way in which how we determine what a good return is now in financial investment practices is shaped fundamentally by the legal arrangements around fiduciary duty. So when somebody who's managing somebody's pension funds, a bank manager is managing somebody else's money, how they invest is governed by law and says explicitly that you need to invest in ways that maximize return, right? And that if you take other things into consideration, that you are breaking your fiduciary duty, you can go to jail for that, right? So there's a legal arrangement that basically imbues our financial system with an objective. But when you look at ordinary people and you ask them, so recently there was in the Netherlands, their retail sector pension fund, which is huge. It has like $8 billion worth of assets. Recently did a random selection of people who were beneficiaries of the fund. And over multiple weekends, they talked about how the fund was invested and all that. And they basically got recommendations from these assemblies. They weren't like binding, so they don't have to do this stuff. But the people who took part in it basically said, yeah, we want a return. Like we want to be able to get something out of this when we retire, but we also care about the impact of the investments. So if we have to have a slightly lower rate of return, and that means we're not investing in genocide, or we're not investing in things that principally benefit the elite, like we're okay with that. And so we need to figure out mechanisms of incorporating ordinary people's values into what we think a good return is. And that's where I think democracy comes into it. And just very kind of end on the point about capital strikes. We're over time now. Very briefly, because I'm standing between you and the outside world. Setting up these democratic pools of finance is a way to counteract the impacts of capital strikes. So disinvestment. Like if you have a pool of investment at your ready, you can reinvest in things that are being disinvested from. And there's actually something of a history of this, which I won't go into. But in the 1970s, there were plans during moments of deindustrialization to set up funds that would reinvest in areas that are being. What's that?
Go ahead.
It was Carter.
Okay.
But I will end it there because Adrian is looking very upset.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the Haven Parade Center for Social Justice, I'd really like to thank Mike and Randy for a wonderful talk and a really great discussion. And to you all, our audience, both in the room and at home, thank you so much for attending, and we hope you come back again. Thanks so much.